Ladies and gentlemen, I really hope it's playing right now.
Yes, it is.
Welcome to the Inklings. This is
Woohoo!
technically episode 3.
Yep.
So last week we had a lot of fun building a world, kind of doing a
Yep.
world building exercise. And today we're going to be focusing on the bread and butter of any good story, which is
The care.
the characters.
Something that I think can be rather challenging, especially for somebody just starting out writing, is how do I write a character? What does that character look like? And how can I come up with, especially something that's really challenging, how do I come up with their name?
Their name, and it's like I said earlier, they're the bread and butter. The characters are what pull the story along. Without them, you might have a cool idea, but they're the force. They're the moving,
So I'm going to be going through a checklist that I made of like different aspects of a character that are very important that you can flesh out in any story. And I'll link the aspects of these down in the description below, as I kind of did for some of the stuff last week, and some resources as well to kind of go along with that with the game that I have planned at the end. Games are fun. So obviously, with any good character, let's start with how most people would be described, with their name. So names, very important for a character, and they can take on different aspects. So some of them can be intentional names,
Sure.
so referencing different things. Like, for example, in The Hobbit, a lot of the dwarves' names were in reference to other folklore and different things that Tolkien borrowed from. That can be one instance. Another instance is they can be named after something.
Sure.
So, like, name of a plant, for example.
One thing that I want to add with the name though is when you're crafting a story, it is very. I think it's important to make sure those names are in line with the genre or the setting. Because if you're telling a fantasy story with some guy named Chad,
Darn old Chad.
I mean, I guess you could make the argument that it's a comedic, some guy from our world drops into medieval times and his name is Chad. But if you're telling a strictly high fantasy story, for example, you probably don't want a guy named Chad running around.
Or you could.
You could. I guess nothing's off the table, but I think it's important to kind of set kind of guidelines for yourself. And there is a lot of echo in this room.
Echo.
And it's kind of like reverberating in my ears as I'm talking. But yes, kind of setting guidelines for yourself on basically what's permissible in your world for, how these characters are going to be described.
Yeah. And I'll give an example of like one of my characters and one of my more fleshed out characters as well.
And this is from your story.
From my personal story, so you're not going to see it in the list down below the game that you'll see. So for me, a lot of my characters I actually did randomly. So where you take the keyboard, so you have the keyboard, you just go like this. And you don't look at the computer, and then you look at what you made, and then
yes,
insert different. You put different like vowels in different places, consonants. I'm like, yep, that sounds like a name to me. That's the majority of my names, actually. And then I'm like, yeah, maybe I should make a couple that actually make more sense.
It is funny though, and I'm gonna go off on a little tangent here because you sparked something.
Some of those names are actually pretty good that I did.
Well, it's funny because I've always wondered how do people, and I do it myself because I've come up with fictional names too, and I'm still sitting here thinking, how do people come up with this stuff? But maybe they're just doing what you're doing and just going, hey,
you just make it look natural, and it's like, you know what? That's not a horrible name. Like you'll see a couple of those actually in the game that I have. Whether or not it actually lands on them or not, we'll find out. But yeah, that's initially how I did them, and honestly, it kind of works.
For me, it's. I don't think I've ever done that, personally, where I've just slammed my hands on the keyboard and hoped it worked. But it's definitely been a lot of let me put like different sounds together that I think until I hit something. One of my characters, Melilot. That's a name that I came up with, um, and I just liked the way it sounded. And it was a lot of experimentation with how different, combinations of letters to work together. I didn't do the random, this, but it was, there was still an element of, I guess, randomness to it.
Yeah.
But
And especially as I got older and more mature for some of my like writing and some things like that, the characters themselves started having deeper and deeper meaning to their names. So, an example of this, which is what I was referring to. So, something in my story. So, the forest gnomes that I have in the story, each of them have a specific name that's attributed to some sort of plant life. Often they wear it on their person, that specific plant, and is often their name. So, in my story, I have a little gnome lad named Agaricus.
I remember you talking about him in your story video.
So when the characters first meet this character, he is in the underground, where it is very dark. And something that illuminated in the midst of the dark was a little green glowing mushroom in his cap. That is his name, Agaricus. It is, and I did research for some of this because I'm like, what's a glow in the dark mushroom that I can name this guy after? Because he cares for his mushrooms and different things like that. So I named him off of a glow in the dark fungus found called, like, the scientific name of it is called I don't even know how to say it. Neonopotanus gardneri species, which I probably butchered that.
Oh, you most definitely
Which
butchered it.
was once classified as Agaricus
Okay.
gardneri. So that's where the Agaricus comes in.
I think you should have named him Neo or whatever it was called.
So
Or Chad.
that's that or Chad. Yeah, so that's how Agaricus was named in my story. And it serves more as that's kind of cool for like the inspiration behind the name.
Yeah.
But there's a whole everything that goes around with it, which makes him more part of the world, which is very awesome in that way. But kind of going with names are sometimes symbolic, different things like that. But yeah, so that's one element of character creation. And I guess we'll go through the elements of character creation, then we can kind of go with what we talked last week with our short story and kind of some of the ideas that we have there. And then we'll get into a game that I have at the end because games are fun. So another aspect of character creation is backstory. So the backstory of a character, kind of what the backbone of what or where they have been or what they have done.
It's the setup for
it's the setup for your character in the moment. So this can obviously give a lot of development to a character or begin some of those character arcs. And can show a look of maturity or like either growing or lessening maturity as the story progresses. And it just gives you a better feel of the character. In some stories, you don't necessarily have to have a backstory, but I feel, especially like fantasy and different things like that, I feel like it's very important to kind of develop this kind of backstory.
Sure.
To make the characters more, you relate to them more. Do you have anything to add to that? Or?
I know for me, like, backstory is one of those things that it can seem daunting, especially when you're just starting out. And so kind of just start with your main protagonist and, keep it simple. It's like, and then you go more in depth the more you continue and as you go. And I kind of go back to my own, main character in my story, Silas. He was the first character that kind of I created to the story, and I knew his backstory was going to be tragic. As
There's a lot of main characters typically have a lot of that.
because I knew that I wanted the narrative to focus on him finding, purpose and meaning in life once again. And those were kind of the two elements, and that kind of forged the rest of his backstory. It was just those two little elements. Like, okay, he starts from tragedy. How do I get to him being fulfilled and happy?
And we'll get kind of a little bit into that next
For sure.
week in the plot.
Absolutely, but again, it was just those two little things, and then I developed his kind of backstory and character around those. But it was a good starting point.
Yeah.
It's just these two little prongs on a multifaceted, person.
And something that I can say is like in a word of encouragement for people that are writing, it doesn't have to be super complicated at first. Just start with simple things. Like all it takes is a spark to start to get your creative mental state going, or different things like that. Like some of these are just suggestions sometimes, and once you start filling up some of the things on this like checklist, you'll start to kind of put pieces together.
A lot of the times ideas they do flow naturally,
Yeah.
You'll just start writing and then you'll go, that's a good idea, and then you'll do that, or you'll find a spark of inspiration. You'll read something or see something, you're like, I like that, how can I make it my own? Sort of deal. So it really just allow it to come naturally. Use a checklist like this to get those ideas flowing, but you don't have to be strict and stick to it if something sparks that inspiration.
Ideas are fluid, so they change and do things over time, as we know as writers, where we edit a lot of I've edited characters as I've written them. Like they change over time because I get more and more comfortable with them being a certain way.
Yeah.
Like you're not forced, you're not pigeonholed into something.
But that's also the great thing about characters, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more later on, but it leads into development, character development. A good character doesn't stay stagnant. They grow.
Yeah.
Or I guess, they regress depending on the purpose of the story, right? Which I know you talked a little bit about briefly earlier. But yeah, you might have a great idea but you're not sure how it fits into this character's story yet. Maybe it will. You just got to get there first.
And sometimes some of the best things to do about a character is write about them. Just to get an idea of how they would respond to different aspects in different environments.
And that's another great exercise you can do building off of that is take it, and maybe this is something, if you're interested, we could put together like a scenario list, like, they're facing,
D&D.
Yeah.
Like, for example, Agaricus is a character I actually used in D&D to flesh out his character.
Sure.
Obviously, you don't have to use things like D&D, but it's a role-playing game. You have to be in the mindset of the character
But it's something like, or just do like a personality sort of checklist. Like, how would this character respond when they're sad? How would they respond when they're angry, when they're happy, when they're scared? Just how would I flesh out their different emotions? Because not we all understand these emotions, but everybody responds to them differently. Yeah. So how is each individual character going to respond to different sort of situations, different feelings, different whatever? Those are helpful too. Yeah. Or as Brandon said, if you want to go into D&D, that's a really personal way to kind of experience this character firsthand and develop how they behave and interact with the world around them.
Yeah.
It's a little more intensive.
Yes, it's definitely a more intensive way of doing it.
It might also be one of the better ways to do it. Because again, it helps you experience them from a almost first-person perspective.
Yes, yeah. And to kind of go along with kind of the interactions of that is you also you kind of learn the flaws in the pros, and like basically the pros and cons of a character. So what are the things they struggle with? What are some of the things they excel at? Like some of those things, like you ask these things, like it's in normal day life, even to you, where you're like, what is something you're good at?
Yeah, think of it almost like you could think of it as like a job interview. Like, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Nothing. I
don't think I'm weak at anything. Okay, I get it.
So Brandon, kind of using let's use Agaricus as an example. What would you say is his greatest strength and one of his greatest weaknesses as a character?
So one of his greatest strengths, at least for what I've built so far in the story, is he's very like kind and being able to basically be right with somebody and very intentional with interacting with
Very
them.
empathetic. Then.
Yeah. Being very supportive in a way, like, because he takes on more of like a grandfatherly role, even though he's like 2 foot, which it's just an interesting quirk. One of his biggest flaws, I would say, is he's very hesitant in what he wants to do sometimes, especially when it comes to using his greatest strength with, at least in power, which is magic. Which goes a little bit to his backstory, where he's one of the greatest magic users
Ever.
like in a good long distance. He does not use magic. He almost vowed to himself, I will not use this, because things that he has accidentally done in the past.
Sure.
Again,
Which again, that's a great way. Again, you just even if you
and that
didn't know anything about your character, you go, okay, I want them to be hesitant. Immediately, you now have a throwaway to maybe they've done something in their past.
It's different
feel
things.
bad.
Like this actually all started because I wanted him to have the quirk of he's a great magic user that doesn't like using magic.
See, and that's another great way. I mean, it's just these little things that help you understand your character
It
better.
brings more. It kind of brings into the backstory, brings into some of these other things from just a little tiny
Spark.
a little nugget. Obviously, you have things like race, gender, and then the race being like elf, dwarf, different things like that.
And those are
a lot of fantasy things, obviously.
now, and
we're
again,
both
it
in
depends
fantasy.
on if you're creating a fantasy story or not. But again, those things can help build those characters more. So if you're doing a fantasy story, maybe your character is an elf, and well, how do elves interact with the world that you're creating or whatever? For me, I've done a lot of my own fictional races, and so for me, it's a lot of there's a lot more, it's very nuanced in the sense that these aren't, pre-established ideas or that you see. And so there's a lot more development that goes in there, which is its own can of worms, and it's simultaneously empowered me and distressed me all at the same time. But that's for future discussion.
Yeah.
The pain of
Yeah.
of world building.
Like, obviously, you can make it as complicated or less complicated as you want to. Or you could just stick with human. It's the easiest thing to do.
We're all human. We get it.
And then other things that I think are helpful for like creating character. What's their goal in life?
Mhm.
Like, what are some of the goals that they strive to or try to aim towards?
But Brandon, what if your character is
Doesn't
completely
have a goal.
apathetic and they have no goals?
That's
That's their goal.
their goal, to have no goal. Which that leads
But
to
again,
an interesting thing.
Yeah, it'd be its own interesting, plotline. Oh, nothing has meaning or matters. It's kind of that nihilist, perspective. Well, we're gonna make them feel meaning. That's our goal as a writer, is for them to feel meaning.
Other things, kind of going back to you called it a job description for.
Yeah.
So what's their job?
What's their profession? And again, one thing that's kind of fun is if you look at like D&D, it can kind of give you, and again, that's more for the gameplay aspect of D&D, but maybe they're a mage, or maybe they're a knight, or you can even think broader, maybe they're a carpenter, maybe they're a painter, maybe, who knows? But it, again, helps
Or maybe they're a
establish-
school student.
Or maybe they don't have a job because they're apathetic towards everything. I.e., we're only I'm describing Chad.
Rip Chad. I'm sorry if your name is Chad in the comment. Anybody watching?
No regrets. But I sincerely apologize. Please don't hate me.
Obviously, other really important things like something, again, I think of D&D, again, when I think of this, is character alignment. Like, how is your character aligned in a good, evil kind of narrative? So it goes to like the chart.
Chaos.
Oh no.
Does that make sense? Nah, not really.
Yeah, but that's your neutral, chaotic, and then lawful. So good, evil, neutral, and somewhere in that gamut of all that kind of stuff. Basically, how does your character make decisions? Why do they make decisions? Different things.
So
Are they for themselves? Are they not for themselves? Are they to the law? Like, the rules are the rules kind of thing? Or are they like, rules are made for those who actually obey them?
Well, and that's what's interesting about that alignment chart too, because you see it all over the place with different, mediums and, pop culture stuff. But I think there's a lot more nuance to it than people maybe realize. Is you can have a protagonist who is chaotic good.
You're Robin Hood.
Yes, they're a Robin Hood sort of figure. They're maybe a vigilante sort of character. Or have a villain and an antagonist who's lawful evil, Maybe they're a figure of great esteem, but there's some corruption going on behind the background. You never know. And I think it can, again, it's a baseline, but it can help you understand these characters' perspectives and how they approach their day-to-day a little more.
Yeah, and then some of what can also kind of go with it as well is you have conflicts. So how does your character kind of deal with conflict?
Hot coffee in the face every single time.
Do they start the conflict? Do they end the conflict?
Chad is Chad.
Just different things like that. And that kind of lends itself to also like personality, different things in that vein. And then you get to some of your physical attributes. So what's their clothing like? Like, as you're describing them in the story, what are they wearing? Do they always wear this? Like, what? Basically, how well off are they? Or different things, just different things like that can help you kind of describe your character. Also with like hair color, eye color, age, height, weight, all that kind of stuff. Kind of can also give kind of meaning to some of your character as well. And honestly, that's just a little snapshot into character building. Obviously, there's a lot more it can go deep into, but those are some of like the baseline. Here's some of the points of interest that you kind of want to get at to like really kind of get an idea of who your character is. So now that we've gone through that, how about we talk about our own short story that we're going to be making? You can bring up the examples that we...
If you remember from last week, or if you didn't tune in and you just want to know, ideally you would go back and watch the other video because it's really good. But needless to say, so basically we're writing a short story about Chad. No, I'm just kidding. So we did some world building last week. Kind of developing a setting, a theme, some tools that the characters that we're going to be working on and creating today would be using and working with. So we've got some very interesting choices because this was done by a random draw.
Yep.
So our setting is the Arctic tundra.
Yep.
So take that as you will. With low gravity. Again, who knows what's going to happen there. And it is a survival story. So, a lot of options there. But I've been talking with Brandon. We've settled on Chad, so...
Nope.
No.
I know I did a little bit of digging myself. And this is kind of going toward the naming aspect as well. because I think last week we were talking about all maybe animal based and different things, and I think we kind of agreed that we'd like to go in the animal route.
So yeah, think of like Redwall or something like that, where animal characters.
Yeah.
That's just kind of where my mind jumps immediately. Is
I
Redwall
think
sort
of like the book series. I can't remember what its name, but it's like cats and dogs, and they're.
Okay.
I can't remember.
Berenstein Bears, got it.
No. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but they had like Shadow Paw and like all the.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
I know
like
what
the warrior cats,
Yes,
sort of thing.
yes. I don't remember what it's called,
I think it's
but
warriors.
it's that. It might be Warriors.
See, it's interesting that your mind goes there, but my mind went to Redwall, where it's like it's animals, but they're knights.
But again, it's that kind of idea. At least that's the idea I had in my head when I'm thinking of animal character. Like they exhibit human interaction, but they're animals.
Sure.
So you get the same thoughts and everything that are going in like as if a human would, but in the form of animals, and they do animal things. So I was thinking of an Arctic fox because when I think of the Arctic, one of the things that comes to mind is an Arctic fox, and I think they're adorable, they're cute. I also thought of polar bear, but I'm like, maybe that would be more of like an antagonist kind of thing.
Maybe.
But I was thinking Arctic fox.
Sorry, my contact is acting up. I'm good. Chad got me through it.
Good old Chad.
New lore drop. He'll be popping up from time to time.
No, but I was thinking of that, and then I was doing because sometimes I like to start with names as a way to kind of get to know my character and then flesh things out from that point onward. So, and that'll be the game we do later. After we kind of flesh out some of the things, and we'll be fleshing some of this out on our own time as well a little bit. So I had a list of names that I actually took the time and researched in the Inuit language. So for those who don't know, like Eskimos, things like that live in the Arctic, in the tundra, and kind of looked at what their words for some of different things or things that popped up. Like I was looking for the word ash, but that didn't show up. Like fire, soot, ash kind of thing. It did. I couldn't find any specific word for that. I wanted to, because I was thinking of like an ashen pelt Arctic fox, like kind of like an ugly duckling, like it permanently has this, because Arctic foxes always change their pelt color depending on the season. Have it be winter, and you have a pelt that's ashen gray permanently. Interesting idea. That's kind of the idea my mind kind of goes into. And again, this is kind of off of realism, kind of goes off of some of these other things, whereas it's a little bit different than what Jonathan would think with like whimsy and different things like that. So I'm going to go to actually the storyboard thing that I had on my phone that I started putting into. So I'm like, ash gray Arctic fox stands out, kind of like the story of Ugly Duckling, like I said. And then for the naming route, I was thinking of doing Inuit language, but there's a lot of things that end with Q, A, and K.
My favorite letters.
Which is interesting.
Not really.
So I took a couple that kind of stood out to me as different things, and then I'll say what they actually mean in Inuit language. Well, at least according to like the sources that I found on Google. So some with Google, and then some I actually looked up the like Alaskan dictionary Inuit stuff. Like it was 200 something pages long that I took a look at. That was a lot, and they all look the same for some of them. So I'm just going to go into a couple of them and see what you think about them. So I have Kaya, which means mountain.
Okay.
Koda, which means friend. Mishka, little bear. Inua, Moon, Takani, which means wolf, and then I'm not gonna say the full name of this because I don't even know how to say it, but Terigian, which is
me see
Arctic
it.
fox.
No idea.
So those are kind of some of the names I was thinking of. So mountain, friend, little bear, moon, wolf, fox. I kind of like Takani, to be completely honest, because it could be like, he looks like a little wolf, even though he's a fox, because of the pelt color.
Sure.
So that's one of the ideas, and I'm kind of more leaning toward that. Or if you want the pelt to be more of a brown, then I'm like Mishka, the little bear. I don't know. There's
Well, I even think back to what we were talking about a little bit last week. I'm doing two separate characters. And I think back to, you mentioned polar bear. What if it was a polar bear cub? You do the little bear name for that, and then do the Arctic fox and some sort of
because
connection there.
I wanted to use Nanook, which is polar bear in Inuit. And I wanted there to be some sort of polar bear interaction, because when you think of the Arctic, you think of the polar bear for first and foremost, I think. And personally, I think of the Arctic fox or a wolf or something along those lines. Obviously, you have like caribou, other things like that. Again, that goes with the biome that we picked. It starts leading me in the direction of different wildlife that are there. Like what I was thinking potentially is you have like your character, but it's split almost in two personalities. So you, within the mind and within physical.
Okay.
So you're in the mind is more of your whimsy. The rivers are floating, like
Sure.
frozen. Everything's low gravity, different things. As the character themselves are moving through the physical world and trying to figure out how to survive and how to thrive in the midst of what I initially think of as tragedy, saying like, you know, how foxes live in, you know, packs in a family or whatever in their den. If something were to happen in that den, such as a cave in or something, or something where only one of them survive at the end, and basically trying to survive, get food, get everything. And something I learned that they'll often follow polar bears, so Arctic foxes will follow polar bears to scavenge for food if they're in dire straits. So that's where it's like some of these things can happen, and some of these interactions can be set up for future action scenes, plot, whatever you want to call it later. So that was some of my initial thoughts
Sure.
on it. And obviously you can give your own thoughts toward it as well. I don't want to just take control over everything. So yeah.
I like it.
And then if we were to go off of some of the things, like some of the checklists that I was having, male or female, I'm not sure yet. Depends on the name we use, but honestly, masculine or feminine, it doesn't really matter, because they kind of sound good either way, because you can have a male or female name for some of the names I listed. I could be down for either. I don't really care. I mean, personally, my main character in my main story is female, so it doesn't bother me any. But anyway, that's some of that. And then obviously they're not really going to have clothing because they're an animal. Yeah. Goals, survive. The survival kind of thing. But like some of the backstory is, well, family perishes. They're the only remaining survivor. That's where you kind of get like potential plot ideas or different things like survivor's guilt or other things like that, where, oh, I could have done something, or if I wasn't here, what could have happened? Other things like that. So survivor's guilt is something that really stands out in some way for me. Or if you don't want to think about like the family mentality, you could think of like, oh, it's a juvenile, an outcast of a certain pack or something that was sent out, and then they got to fend for themselves,
Sure.
kind of thing like that. So it can go different directions. And I kind of made a whole list and mess of notes that I sent Jonathan. He just hasn't really looked at it yet. Because I did some thinking on my own time as well. And obviously, when you come up with some of these yourself, for those coming up, once you start thinking of them, you'll start thinking of a whole bunch of different things, and it kind of waterfalls. So you get one thing, oh, it makes me think of this, which makes me think of this, which makes me think of this, and then you're kind of in that headspace. And sometimes it can be really good to just kind of list everything out, write everything out that you're thinking, even if you're not necessarily going to be using some of those things.
Sure.
So obviously we're talking about some of the things that we're going to go through. And obviously I'm saying my point of view right now. You'll find it as we're starting to write about some of these things. But I'm just saying what's off the dome for me, that came to mind for me. So that's what I got. Do you have any thoughts?
Not particularly.
All right, then I think we will try to do this game before it gets too late. I knew this one would be a little bit longer because character creation is important, in depth. And I know we didn't really go into so much of the checklist because if we actually went down the checklist for our character, it would take forever. But just know that we're going through the same processes and different things. And I'm just sharing a little bits of what I was thinking as I was going down them. So, kind of going to what I talked about earlier. So, there's a game that I want to do, which is to create character from a name.
Okay.
So, something that I often did in my early stages of creating a character is because I never knew what to name them. So, there was a site that I would go to, and I'm going to share this with you guys now, it's the fantasy name generator. Because I don't know what the heck I'm doing some of the times. So I would go to the fantasy name generator here, and I would generate names. Now they've since increased its capability since I've last been on it, but you can go to all these different things to get different names or places names that you can get. So for what I ended up doing, I did folklore and fantasy. So you look at this, and it gets all these different options for different names, like dragon names, griffin names, different things like that. So let's go in for an example of what this might look like. So let's go half-elf names, for example. So you scroll down, and it gives you a list of some names. So there's a list, I think, of 10 names. And they can be whatever, and they're just automatically generated random names. Good old Falford right there. But like it gives you the option: get male names, get female names. So like, let's take an example of female names. So these are some of your female names. How do they create some of these things? I'm not entirely sure sometimes. But like for the example of like there's Hobbit names, for example, they'll take from inspiration from the book and use some of the names they already have for some of the hobbits in them to create some of the names. So these are some of the things that pop up, and I think it's a really good resource for those who may not have an idea of what they're going to name. Obviously, I chose an elf, so that some of the names on there are a little challenging to pronounce. Like I don't even know how to pronounce some of them, but sometimes I mix and match. So maybe a last name like this could be a good name, or this is a good name. There's different options that you could do, and you can mix and match for some things, but I just think it's a really good resource, and I'll link that in the description below. And then something that I wanted to do is what I ended up doing is I took some names that I generated on this website and put it on a wheel. So basically, the game or the idea that I had is I'm going to spin the wheel and we'll create a character from it. So 10 of these names are from the site, 10 of them I made up myself.
Okay.
So obviously Jonathan has no idea what is what. And some have first names and last names, some just have one name, different things like that. So I'm gonna spin the wheel and we're gonna create a name, create a character from it.
Beautiful.
And sometimes this is the best way to create a character by starting out with a name. Obviously, ideally, you would like to have an idea of what that name is, so you have an idea of what that character can be. But for the random names that I took from this, I went to different like things like dragon, elf, different things that I just kind of took an inspiration from a bunch of different things in there. So yeah, I'll spin it and then we'll see what we get. So you guys will be able to see this as well. So the name we will be going off of is Zespia. So that is the name. Oops. Keep clicking through that, even though I meant to click this. Sorry. Anyway. So, Zespia. What's the first thing that you think of? Coughing. Got it.
Now, is this for the character in the short story?
No, this is just
random.
This is random. Just if anybody watching were to do something similar to this, what would you do?
Zespia with a Z.
With
I
a Z.
couldn't see it very well because my eyes
Yeah.
stuck. My mind kind of leans towards. It gives off a roguish vibe.
Okay.
So I kind of think like a thief or something, just with that name. And maybe it's the correlation with Z and
Yeah.
Zorro and kind of
Yeah.
that. The other thing that kind of jumps to mind is wind.
Okay.
And that one is a little harder to explain because I don't really have an explanation for it. That's kind of where my mind jumps. So rogue and wind rogue,
And
roguish wind.
to be honest, like to be honest, like rogue is also something that kind of came to mind for me. This was not one of my names, by the way. So it's more effective because I'm going to be leaning toward what I actually have the characters being if I were doing my own. But so Zespia, I don't know. The Z kind of like you were saying kind of gives more of the rogue. And it's very pointed, I think, like Zespia. Like it ends abruptly, which makes me think like kind of the weapon that they might use.
Sure.
So whether that's a dagger, whether that's like poison, whatever you want to call them, like darts. But they're not darts, they're like metal. I don't know what they're called.
The stars?
No, it's not a shuriken. It's needles, like poison needles, but I don't know what they're.
I don't know what you're. Yeah, I know what you're trying to say. I don't know what it's called either.
Think of like Sheik in like Legend of Zelda.
Aren't they just throwing daggers, throwing knives?
Well, it's more needle-like. But anyway, that's the kind of weapon I kind of imagine them. So like kind of, I want to say like stealthy, like hooded, cloaked. Obviously, I think female character.
Okay.
Given the more feminine side of the name.
Sure.
Ends with an A, kind of ordeal. The name itself kind of gives female. I wouldn't think of a male being called Zespia.
No, you're right.
Just some of the ideas that I would have, and then some of the backstory. Obviously, I think of one of my other rogue character backstories being rather depressing, but basically maybe they grew up in it but don't really want to be in the rogue business, but don't really know anything else.
Sure.
So they still do it even if it's unknowingly. So, like, for example, my rogue that I have, Amy, is a pickpocket and kleptomaniac.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll just yoink things without realizing it. So imagine that in the Pink Panther. There's the big diamond or whatever. Just what? I don't see no diamond. What diamond?
When you're holding,
I'm not
when
holding
you threw
anything.
behind your back, the one that Chad's holding.
Chad.
What you doing, buddy?
But yeah, so that's some of what I think. And honestly, like, and feel free to use some of the names I even have on the list. Like, here, let me go back to the
Wheel of Fortune.
back to the wheel. So some of the names on here that I had. So you have like Jada, Illumnir, Nocturne, Calamus, Eldrios, Numac, Rixie, and then some of the ones with last names. I'm not going to go into every single one because I'm not going to read them all off. But I can put that in the description below. Feel free to use them. Feel free to use them. And you can take first, last name.
In fact, it looks like you can just share that wheel. You might be able to share the actual wheel that he's using.
Yeah, I should be able to actually share the wheel. Yeah.
And that way you can just spin the wheel.
Spin the wheel and see what character you get. And then maybe you make a story off of whatever character this lands on. Which is the same one.
Yeah.
So
looks like everybody's making a Zespia.
But anyway, so take a look at some of these. Actually, this one right here is one that I made. Don't actually ask me how to say it.
How do you spell it? I can't see it. It's the
Ilthurin.
yellow and my eyes.
So it's like Ilthurin. So Illthuryn.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's an elf. But that's one I actually came up with the random hitting it randomly. Sometimes it really works, let me tell you. I actually really like that name. But that's one of them I made. So I like it. It's my Minecraft name too. Because I liked it that much. Anyway. So dang it, I did it again. Oops. All right. I'm going to just stop it. So then if it ends up going to that, then I will not do it anymore. All right. So anyway, that's character building.
Pretty complicated, pretty simple, all at the same time.
Yeah. And I'll link some stuff in the description below, just so you have an idea of some of the things that we can go through. And I think that will be it for this video. And we will join you next week for more short story chaos. Especially as we get to plot. How complicated and how messed up can we make a plot for our characters? And kind of getting into some of the cornerstone or key pieces of what makes a good plot. Or what is plot.
Yeah, because we don't know. I mean, maybe the plots we've come up with up until this point have been terrible. So, do we really know how to make a good plot? I don't know.
Because some of these things can be kind of difficult to do.
Yeah.
And we're basically trying to come up with a story relatively quickly with like almost no prep.
And a lot of it random.
But hopefully this is kind of an inspiration, especially when we start getting actually writing it. And we'll kind of show the first steps, because I'm thinking one of the episodes will be like how to start, and another one will be how to end when we get closer to the end point, and then the whole publishing aspect, which
is a whole other animal.
I don't even know really how to do that. Like, there's self-publishing, there's other things too. We'll get to that when we get to it. But anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks again for watching. Feel free to comment different ideas that you might have for our character, for our short story, and let us know in the comments what your Zespia. what character?
It is exclusively Zespia.
What
the rest of the wheel doesn't work.
What character would you make, or what would that character look like for you? So let us know down below, and we will catch you on the flip side.
That kind of rhymed. Let us know down below.
We'll have to use that later. Anyway,
Bye, guys.
bye.
Say hi.